Welcome to the Vaxa Intelligence Optimised podcast. Today, I'm joined by two guests with extensive experience as senior diplomats in the Indo-Pacific. John Hennessey-Niland was the U.S ambassador to Palau. He was also the second in charge at the embassy in Australia. Also joining me is Captain Matt Ort, the former U.S naval attaché to Australia and now the managing partner of Vaxa Bureau, United States.
John, we've been trying to get together for a while. Last time we were having a chat, you're on a remote island up in Northern Asia, and we had some communications issues, funnily enough. But
Very true. A different island, not Palau. I spent the summer in Taiwan. So I won't cast any aspersions as to who may have been behind, those problems with us getting to chat. But I think tonight will work.
Thank you, mate. I really appreciate your time. So, John and Matt, really interested in learning more about your experiences, your lived experiences and time down here, especially in the South Pacific, and understanding what the South Pacific means to regional and global security. John, in your time as the ambassador to Palau and also your time down here in Australia as well, love to hear some insights.
Sure. And I'll start off by saying I've spent a lot of my career in that part of the world. And I think I may have the distinction of being perhaps one of the very few, maybe the only American diplomat who's been to every single sovereign nation in the Pacific. And if you think about membership of the Pacific Island Forum, around 30, and if you include the French territories and other places, the one great thing I will say about working with the U.S. military is that, unlike the State Department, they have resources. And one nice thing that commanders have is an aircraft. And being able to get on what was affectionately known as the Gray Ghost, which was the aircraft that the Marines used, formerly of the Navy. But actually, funny story, the Navy wrote it off because it was damaged in some hurricane or storm. The Navy said, "No, we can't fix it. We just got another one." The Marine Corps, which is a little bit like the State Department, resource constrained, said, "Oh no, we'll take it," and they fixed it. But I will be honest, every time we flew on it, we're like, is this the time it finally breaks down?
They fixed it, John. You realize 95% of that aircraft was duct tape.
Yes, but the expression was the same when we were flying in Helos or Ospreys. If it leaks, you're doing okay. You have to worry when it doesn't leak. Then it means you run out of hydraulic fluids or whatever it is. I'm not an expert in these things. So it's okay. It worked, and it got us around the region. And the one thing about the region, obviously, it's a huge place. And maybe we start there, right? I think sometimes we regard the Pacific as flyover country. I'm from the Midwest United States, right? And the continental United States is a big place, just like Australia. But in the middle, there's things going on that matter. But people just fly over and don't pay enough attention. And I think that has been the U.S. problem for many, many years in the Pacific. It hasn't been disinterest. It's been more of a benign neglect, right? There's so many other problems in the world that we are paying attention to. We haven't paid enough attention to the Pacific community. And I think for obvious reasons, one of them being that we're being forced in a way to pay more attention in the region has led to greater interest, more resources coming into the area. And I think that's a positive because I am biased. I admit, I just said I've been to every part of the Pacific. But even our presidents have said in the national strategic, national security strategies and in our papers on the Indo-Pacific, America's future is going to be made in Asia. America is not secure if you think of supply chains, shipping lanes, communications. We are endangered if the Pacific becomes a contested area. And so for the longest time, since the days of Commodore Perry, for heck's sake, I think we've understood that. But we are, to be honest, playing catch up. My Australian friends have put it this way to me when I served in Canberra. It's great that Australia is stepping up, and it's great that America and other like-minded countries are doing more. But what it really means right now is simply we're losing less quickly. Think about that. We're losing less quickly. And so
that brings up a good point, John. Actually, one of the things I was thinking, we've been pivoting to the Pacific for what now, like 15 years, right? You were most recently in Palau. Is there an increased push in for discussing contested logistics, fuel storage with these island countries, these island nations? Did you see a lot more of that?
Yes. One would answer yes. And I'll back up. I agree with you. We've pivoted so many times to the Pacific. People wonder if it's become a pirouette, and we're just chasing our tail. But I think we're getting out of that death spiral, if you will, because obviously we have a particular focus now, which is the People's Republic of China and their coercive behavior and revisionist sort of approach to a rules-based international order. So we are stepping up, but it's uneven. Our military, as usual, is out front. There is bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress for doing more to counter the China threat. And when I say the China threat, let me just be clear. I mean the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force, and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people. I was fortunate to travel to China many times before I went to Taiwan. I can't go now back to mainland because I went to Taiwan, but I'm glad I did it in that order. Because the Chinese people are dynamic. The business community there is impressive. They have a wonderful culture. So I don't have any issues with China. I have issues with the behavior of the Chinese government and the military in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly in the Pacific Islands, because it's abusive, it's corrupting, it's coercive. And we talk about gray zone activities, and that sounds somewhat academic. It's not academic. In the Pacific Islands, we're kicking each other under the tables every day, and it's vigorous. And as Matt said, it's contested. I have seen a number of developments just in my patch, which is the Republic of Palau. And by the way, Palau's not that small. On a lot of maps, it doesn't exist, so people think it's tiny. It's the second largest landmass in Micronesia, right? It's 300 islands. It's EEZ. Exclusive economic zone, when you combine it with the other two states in Micronesia, Marshall Islands and Micronesia, it's the size of the continental United States. So it's a sizable part of the Pacific. I think 60% of the world's trade travels through Micronesia. If you're going to talk about logistics, and the concern obviously is in the first island chain, Philippines, potentially Taiwan. If that's where the fight's going to be, hopefully we can avoid it, but if that's where the fight's going to be, we have to fight from some other place, right? We have to have an ability to project power. That means the second island chain.
John, it's interesting. You also mentioned a moment ago is that, is the US, pirouetting around that particular, the South Pacific? Have they been over the last couple of years? I recall taking some US Navy ships into Ponape a few years ago now. And there was a new CEO who had just posted on board, and of course he was cautious about his ship. Didn't want to damage his new drive. The only available maps of the area were from 1945, and they were Japanese. So there was no. There was, so of course the CEO's going, I'm not bringing the ship in. I don't want to. And I guess that goes back to the point of, well, if the US had more interest in that particular region, since 45 until, this was, late 2008, 2009, that probably wouldn't have been the case. There would have been up-to-date information on the region. Is the US updating information such as the hydrography of the region and so on and so forth? So it does have the ability to have that logistics footprint in Micronesia.
Yes, we are. And there was, it became a bit of a joke, to be honest with you, around the country team, which is the interagency group at any U.S. embassy. I think Palau is now perhaps the most surveyed country on Earth. We had survey teams coming in from every part of the U.S. military, sometimes surveying exactly the same area. And this gets to some of the problem, right? We're now surging our resources into the area. And I don't think it's a saturation issue for the host countries. My experience is they welcome this. There's economic dividends, there's economic benefits. We share that information, which helps them. We try to find partnerships that matter to us, in terms of access, ability to project power into those areas, but also have a legacy of real consequence for these countries. You mentioned navigation, like navigation aids, right, that the Coast Guard works on. Repairing airstrips that date to World War II, that allows us to disperse, our military, so it's not all eggs in one basket. Hopefully we've learned the lesson of, Pearl Harbor. Guam is a missile magnet, is what they call it. So having the ability for agile combat employment, ACE, which is the U.S. Air Force's, expression now to disperse of forces. Marine Corps and Army are working together, believe it or not, in terms of best shooter, best platform, trying to understand how can we use countries like Palau, the second island chain, if there is a conflict, in a manner that helps us win, in any confrontation, particularly in the first island chain. And if you look at a map, the second island chain is just geographically far enough away from the mainland of the People's Republic of China that if we're agile and can maneuver, scoot and shoot, keep another term of art, we might be survivable and be able to defend our interests in the region. So when people say, well, this military buildup places a big target on Palau, I say no. I say it actually improves their defense. And the U.S., by the way, of the compact agreement, has a special responsibility. We're solely responsible for the defense of Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. They're part of the homeland from a military perspective.
Well, in my mind, John, it's not just kinetic, right?
Yes, I hope it doesn't.
The whole contested logistics piece in general. I mean, you could talk about fuel storage, bulk fuel storage, and moving that or being able to move that around quickly, or at least have it in enough places that it doesn't need to be moved around. Or, there's a couple things that we're, kind of working on through Guam, which is like bringing in advanced manufacturing training centers with the universities, train the local folks how to use that equipment, right? And then supply that equipment, and then use that as a hub to run a lot of our repairs through. And, that's good for local economies. It's good for building, our supply chain, and then it's good for pushing China out, right? And so do you think that kind of thing is something that could be, implemented in Palau or Micronesia or any of these other?
I think it's beginning to happen already, Matt. If I think back to Suva and Fiji, that was already seen as sort of a regional logistics hub, right? The Australian Navy would pull in, we would pull in.
A marginal capability right now, John, marginal capability.
That's right. But Palau is the new Fiji, if you want to look at it that way, in so many ways, because we're trying to push, our presence further and further out into the field. We can't do it from, Perth. We can't do it anymore from Suva. We actually have to be closer. And that means places like the second island chain, not just Palau. And, interesting enough, Palau has a capable workforce, right? So us being able to partner with private sector in Palau in terms of minor construction, warehousing, wharfing, fuel, there's enough of an infrastructure there that we can build upon that it makes sense both economically for our private sector, but also in terms of supply and support to our military. And also, and this is what is so important, it also helps the Palauan economy, and that's why it's sustainable. It means jobs, it means money, it builds capacity. We can assist with training up workers. It's a win-win, to use that terrible expression, for so many people. But we're at the beginning of it. The money has now been appropriated by the U.S. Congress. You have the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and a number of other pots of money that have been established, because fortunately there is bipartisan support for the U.S. doing more across the Pacific. But that takes a while, right, to filter from Congress down to, the Joint Chiefs, down to combatant commands, and then being actually used as a range in the field. So that money is flowing through that pipeline. It's not as efficient as it should be. We all know that, but it's starting to arrive. And I saw that in my 3 years in Palau. And, for good or not, I don't see it ending anytime soon because I don't see the threats, diminishing anytime soon.
John and Matt, in your time down here in Australia, in your respective roles, you would have seen, as we mentioned earlier, the I guess the soft diplomacy from our friends to the north, especially and I've seen it firsthand in New Guinea and Nauru, where they'll come and build schools, or they'll build government buildings, or they'll build roads. All of them fall apart within 2 seconds. So they've been trying to win hearts and minds in that region, and some leaders of those particular countries, the Solomon Islands is a good example. They're open to those types of arrangements with our friends to the north. Did you, in your time, see any of that? And if so, what was the response?
Matt, I've talked for a while. Do you want to go first?
Man, I think one of the first things I did when I moved to Australia and started my job as the naval attaché is went and talked to a gentleman who was on Australian 60 Minutes, who had just uncovered a bunch of kind of pay for play in the Solomon Islands, and he had a bunch of folks on camera, taking briefcases of money, out of meetings, and who was it that just that sold their tuna fishery for like $1 million for on a lease for like 100 years?
Yeah,
right?
Nauru.
What?
Nauru.
Nauru,
and
yeah.
that's a fishery that used to net $1 million a day. Anyway, sold it for $1 million for a 99-year lease and a new fire truck, though.
There you go. Yeah, we saw it. And to be honest, we saw it a little bit in Australia too. So, I think the influence operations, the interference, is becoming more and more evident. The PRC has as a lead. They've been doing this for a number of years. You talked about the Belt and Road initiatives that were present across the Pacific. Trying to influence politicians isn't something that any one country is immune to. If you live in a glass house, you shouldn't throw stones. So it's a problem. But the difference is in these small Pacific Island states, unlike Australia, United States, or others, good governance takes a lot of vigilance. Governance structures are not as developed. If you think about it, in the parliaments of these countries, you may have a dozen representatives. It doesn't take a lot to change a vote, from recognition of Taiwan to the PRC, for example, or to reorient their defense and foreign policy to a more independent one. We saw it across the region, and we even saw it, in Australia. And I think part of the reason that people didn't want to believe it is, one, we try to avoid, difficult choices. People were making money, not just the Chinese. And, it was almost seen as harmless, right? We got to sell our wine and our ore to somebody, and these needs in the Pacific Islands are real too. They needed someone to fix their roads, build their buildings, improve their infrastructure. And if Australia or New Zealand or the U.S. weren't going to do it, well, others were more than happy. So I can't necessarily blame anyone for this, but yes, we definitely saw it taking place and ramping up. The one thing, though, about playing catch-up sometime is that quality has a value. It isn't always about quantity. And I think the people in the Pacific Islands are as savvy as anyone else. They play all sides against each other. I mean, we all hedge, right? It's human behavior, and it's understandable. But over time, and don't forget that the PRC has been active in the Pacific for a number of years now, trying to change the orientation of these islands. People have begun to realize, well, it isn't such a great deal after all. Issues of debt diplomacy, places like Kona, which are in huge debt issues with the PRC. some of the facilities that they've built are falling apart. They've built a number of medical facilities in Fiji that are just coming apart. The medical doctors and nurses, may turn out not to be the world's best. Some of the equipment they provide doesn't work, and that has helped. Ironically, I think people understand that quantity has a value of itself, but quality is what matters, and that's what I'm all about. Quality relationships, working together the public and private sector in a way that it's sustainable and benefits all parties.
So John, I guess in wrapping up this particular session, how and why is the Pacific and the islands, so for example, Palau, Nauru, Micronesia, even Melanesia, why is that so important to the security? Why are those islands so important to the security of the region and also globally?
Well, I assume we all have on our desks, even though we can't see it on the screens, a phone, right? Our countries are highly developed, reliant on high technology, right? Taiwan, which is another island just to the north, of Micronesia, produces 92, 93%, depending on the day, of the most advanced silicone chips. Can you imagine working or living in a world where we don't have that capability anymore? If we had to throw away our phones?
Maybe a little bit, like doing COVID a couple of years ago. We lost a bunch of those for a while. I'm still having appliances break.
Matt, COVID was a wake-up call, not just about health issues, but talk about secure supply chain, right? We're all terrified of running out of toilet paper. Well, heck, that's a problem. But can you imagine running out and your phone? You can no longer access the apps that you want. You can't listen to the music that you prefer. 60% of the world trade passes through Micronesia. People don't know that. And not just the old traditional trade, containers on ships. Think about the modern economy, all internet-based. Fiber optic cables, right? Whoa. Take a look at the map, all right? Most of the world's fiber optic cables run just a few hundred miles or less off of these Pacific islands, linking the markets of Asia, America, Europe, and the rest of the world. If those are cut or disrupted or damaged, we lose connectivity. People cannot work. And that is a real problem. And so if you want to understand how important the Pacific Islands are, you don't have to think about World War II and the history. They matter because of where they are strategically. But think of the modern economy. Think of secure supply chains. Think of everything we use on a day-to-day basis. If there's a contingency or conflict in the Pacific Islands, boy, oh boy, are we going to feel it in Australia, the United States, and globally.
John, you talk about those. You talk about those cables. It's funny. One of my last projects before I left Australia was talking about how easy it would be to cut the cables and sever Australia from the rest of the world. And I'm getting old and my numbers are fuzzy. I want to say there are only 6 or 7 ships. It's for sure less than 10 ships in the world that can repair those lines. And
that's right.
In the whole world.
That's right. And they're not owned by government. They're owned by the private sector. So can you imagine trying to reorient these ships to take care of that when they're already booked out for years in advance and we don't have enough of them? It's the equivalent of what happens in the colder regions, the Antarctic or the Arctic, and we don't have enough icebreakers to get down there to do this. Serious problem. And you're right. What will we do?